The autumn of 1993 came early to Richmond, Kentucky. By mid-October, the hills surrounding Eastern Kentucky University had already turned that deep russet gold that photographers love and locals barely notice anymore. The Daniel Boone National Forest pressed right up against the eastern edge of campus, a wall of oak and hickory and pine that had stood there long before the university, long before the town, swallowing hiking trails and logging roads into its shadows. Students rarely went deep into those woods, but Sarah Lynn Garrett wasn't like most students. She was 21 years old that fall, a junior with a double major in environmental science and biology, the kind of young woman who kept her head down in lecture halls but came alive on the ridgelines. Her roommate, Jennifer Pace, would later tell investigators that Sarah spent more time in the forest than in their dorm room. She'd leave before dawn on Saturdays with her backpack and field journal, returning after dark with mud on her boots and notes about bird calls, scat patterns, tree diseases. Jennifer said Sarah had this way of listening to the woods, like she could hear things no one else could. Thursday, October 21st, 1993. Sarah's last known day began like any other. She attended her morning ecology lecture, grabbed lunch alone at the student center, a habit, not loneliness, Jennifer would insist, and spent the afternoon in the library researching her thesis on red-tailed hawk migration patterns through the Cumberland Gap. The library's sign-in sheet showed her arrival at 2:47 p.m. Security footage, grainy and colorless, captured her leaving through the front doors at exactly 6:14 p.m., backpack slung over one shoulder, that green field journal tucked under her arm. She walked east across the commons. The fog had started rolling in around 5 that evening, thick and low, the kind that makes streetlights look like distant moons. 3 students would later report seeing her heading toward the gravel lot near the old maintenance building, the one nobody used much anymore because it sat right at the tree line. After that, nothing. Sarah Lynn Garrett simply walked into the fog and never came back. Her parents waited 2 days before calling campus police. Sarah was an adult, independent, known for her solo excursions. But she'd never missed her Friday morning ornithology lab, never gone more than a day without checking in. By Saturday afternoon, when she still hadn't returned any calls, her father drove the 3 hours from Lexington and filed a missing person report. Campus security treated it seriously from the start. They knew the statistics. They knew what could happen to young women, especially around isolated areas. The initial search focused on the woods behind campus. Volunteers from the university, local fire department, even some of Sarah's professors formed search lines and walked the trails she was known to frequent. The Daniel Boone National Forest is over 700,000 acres of broken terrain, ridges and hollows, limestone caves, creeks that appear and vanish depending on the season. Finding one person in all that, especially if they didn't want to be found or couldn't call out, was like searching for a whisper in a storm. On the 3rd day, a forestry student named Marcus Webb found Sarah's field journal. He'd been searching off-trail, following a narrow drainage creek that fed into a larger stream system about half a mile from campus. The journal was lying face down on the creek bank, partially hidden under wet leaves. The green cover was water-stained but intact. Marcus said later that what struck him most was how carefully it had been placed there, almost like someone had set it down deliberately rather than dropped it. Detective Raymond Kowalski, Richmond PD, was the lead investigator. He was 47 years old in 1993, a Kentucky native who'd worked homicide in Louisville before moving back to his hometown for something quieter. This case would haunt him for the next 3 decades. When he opened Sarah's journal, still damp from the creek, he found page after page of detailed field notes, sketches of bird wings, weather observations, GPS coordinates written in her precise handwriting. The last entry stopped him cold. October 21st, 4:30 p.m. Red-tailed hawk pair circling North Ridge. Heard something moving parallel to the trail approximately 50 yards east. Too large for deer. Bipedal gait. Stopped when I stopped. Continued when I walked. No visual confirmation. Heavy footfalls. Will investigate tomorrow if weather permits. That was it. The entry ended mid-thought, as if she'd been interrupted or had simply decided to finish later. Detective Kowalski read those lines over and over, sitting in his cruiser with the journal in his lap. Too large for deer. Bipedal gait. He'd been a cop long enough to know that bipedal usually meant human. But something about the clinical way she'd written it, like a scientist documenting an observation, rather than someone worried about being followed, bothered him. The search intensified. State police brought in K9 units. The dogs picked up Sarah's scent near the maintenance building, followed it into the woods along a deer trail, then lost it completely about a quarter-mile in, right where the terrain dropped into a steep hollow. The handlers said it was unusual. Scent doesn't just disappear like that unless there's water involved, or unless the trail goes up, into a vehicle or something elevated. But there were no roads back there, no structures, just trees and stone and the endless folding hills. Days became a week. The October weather turned colder. Richmond is a small enough town that everyone knew everyone, at least by 1 degree of separation. Sarah's face appeared on flyers stapled to telephone poles, in the campus newspaper, on the local evening news. Her parents held a press conference, her mother barely able to speak, her father's hands shaking as he read from a prepared statement. They offered a reward. Tips came in, the usual mix of genuine concern and well-meaning confusion. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station in Corbin. Another caller reported a young woman matching her description hitchhiking near Interstate 75. Every lead turned into smoke. Then, on November 4th, a hunter named Dale Pritchard found the sneaker. Dale had been bow hunting deer in a section of forest about 2 miles northeast of campus, near an abandoned hunting shack that hadn't been used in years. The structure was barely standing, 4 walls of rotting timber and a collapsed roof, the kind of place hunters sometimes used to gut their kills or wait out bad weather decades ago. Dale almost didn't see it, the white sneaker wedged between 2 moss-covered limestone rocks just behind the shack. He thought it was trash at first, then noticed the laces were still tied, clean double knots, like someone had taken it off carefully rather than lost it running. Detective Kowalski drove out there personally. The shack sat in a natural depression, surrounded by dense hardwood forest. No trails led directly to it. You had to know it was there, or stumble across it by accident. Inside the shack, the floor was covered in leaves and animal droppings. But on the north wall, about 7 feet up, someone had noticed something that made Kowalski's skin prickle. 4 parallel grooves in the old wood, deep and deliberate, running vertically for about 18 inches. They looked fresh, the wood inside still pale where the bark had been torn away. The county forensics team took photos, measurements. The grooves were spaced roughly 2 inches apart, too wide for most animal claws. A black bear could make marks like that, they said, though black bears were uncommon in that part of Kentucky and rarely aggressive. But it was possible. Everything was possible. One of the techs, a woman named Paula Chen who'd worked wildlife crime before, crouched down and examined the scratches with a flashlight. "If it's a bear," she said quietly. It was standing on its hind legs. "That's territorial behavior." "Or defensive?" Detective Kowalski asked the question everyone was thinking. Defensive against what? Paula didn't answer. They searched the area around the shack in expanding circles. No body, no clothing, no backpack, just that single sneaker and the marks on the wall. The local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Missing Student's Shoe Found. Search Continues." Television crews came back for a day, filmed the forest, interviewed the detective. Then the story faded from the news cycle. Thanksgiving came and went. Winter settled into the hills. The official search was suspended after 6 weeks, though Sarah's family hired private investigators who kept looking through Christmas. By January 1994, the case had gone cold in every practical sense. Sarah Lynn Garrett was officially listed as missing, presumed dead, though no evidence of foul play had been conclusively established. Her parents held a memorial service in February. Her friends graduated and moved away. Detective Kowalski kept the file on his desk for another 2 years before finally boxing it up and moving it to storage. He never stopped thinking about it, though. Never stopped wondering what had happened in those woods. The theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Some people thought Sarah had simply gotten lost and succumbed to exposure. Late October nights in Kentucky can drop below freezing. Others believed she'd been abducted, that someone had been waiting for her near that parking lot, someone who knew her routine. There were darker theories too, the kind that circulate in small towns, whispered over coffee. The old-timers in Richmond remembered stories their grandparents told, legends about things in the deep forest, creatures that walked like men but weren't, things that had been there long before the settlers came. Most people dismissed that kind of talk, but not everyone. Jennifer Pace, Sarah's roommate, struggled with guilt for years. She gave an interview to a true crime podcast in 2003, 10 years after the disappearance. Her voice was still raw when she talked about it. "Sarah used to tell me she felt safe in the woods," Jennifer said. "Safer than anywhere else. She said the forest had its own rules, and if you respected them, it would respect you. I don't know if she believed that literally or if it was just like a philosophy, but she meant it." She wasn't scared out there, maybe she should have been. The podcast episode ended with the host asking Jennifer if she thought Sarah was still alive somewhere. Jennifer's answer was immediate. No, Sarah would have come back if she could. Something stopped her. I don't know what, but it was final. The case file sat in the Richmond Police Department archives for 31 years. Detectives would occasionally pull it out when similar cases emerged: missing hikers, unexplained disappearances in the Appalachian region, looking for patterns that never quite materialized. Detective Kowalski retired in 2009, but he kept a copy of Sarah's journal entry in his home office, that last observation about something moving parallel to her in the woods. He'd read it sometimes late at night, trying to decode it like a message from another world. Then, in March of 2024, everything changed. A groundskeeper at Eastern Kentucky University, a man named Thomas Riddell, who'd worked campus maintenance for 40 years, was preparing to retire. He'd been cleaning out the old storage basement beneath the maintenance building, the same building near where Sarah was last seen, when he discovered something that had been hidden for 3 decades. Behind a sheet of plywood that had been nailed to the wall, possibly covering asbestos or old electrical panels, Thomas found a small space, maybe 4 feet deep, and inside that space, wrapped in a tarp and plastic sheeting, were human remains. The DNA analysis took 6 weeks. The bones were incomplete, fragmentary, but enough for genetic comparison. On April 29, 2024, the Kentucky State Medical Examiner's Office confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to Sarah Lynn Garrett. She'd been there the whole time, less than 100 feet from where she was last seen alive, hidden in a space that had been sealed up sometime in the mid-1990s. But the DNA evidence solved one mystery and opened a dozen others. Because when forensics examined the bones more closely, they found something that didn't fit any easy explanation. Sarah's left femur showed signs of blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall or a strike from something heavy. Her skull had a fracture along the occipital bone, the kind of injury that would have been immediately fatal or close to it. But there were other marks too, strange scoring along several ribs and the left scapula, marks that looked almost like teeth but weren't quite right. Too large, too deep, spaced wrong for any known animal in Kentucky. Was that evidence of something we can't explain, or just the result of decades underground? The discovery of Sarah Garrett's remains in April 2024 reopened wounds that had never fully healed and raised questions that 31 years had left unanswered. The maintenance building where her body was found had been scheduled for demolition. In another month, maybe 2, the structure would have been reduced to rubble, the hidden compartment and everything in it destroyed without anyone ever knowing. Thomas Riddell, the groundskeeper who made the discovery, told reporters he'd walked past that plywood panel thousands of times over 4 decades. "Never had a reason to look behind it," he said, his voice hollow. "Never thought to." Detective Sarah Vance, no relation to the victim, though the coincidence wasn't lost on anyone, took over the reopened investigation. She was 34 years old, originally from Bowling Green, and had transferred to Richmond PD's Major Crimes Unit 2 years earlier specifically to work cold cases. She'd read about Sarah Garrett's disappearance in a criminology course back in college. Now holding the original case file in her hands, Detective Vance felt the weight of 3 decades pressing down on every page. The hidden compartment was approximately 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, accessible only by removing the plywood panel that had been nailed flush to the wall. Forensic teams determined the panel had been installed sometime between November 1993 and January 1994, based on the type of nails used and the condition of the wood. University maintenance records from that period were incomplete. Budget cuts and administrative turnover meant documentation was spotty at best, but several retired workers remembered a general renovation project in late 1993, minor repairs and upgrades throughout the maintenance building. Someone could have sealed that space without anyone noticing, especially if they'd worked alone during off hours. The remains had been wrapped carefully. That detail disturbed Detective Vance more than almost anything else. This wasn't a panic disposal. The tarp was industrial grade, the kind used in construction. The plastic sheeting was layered, folded with deliberate precision. Whoever put Sarah there had taken time, had been methodical. The medical examiner, Dr. Marcus Holland, noted during his preliminary report that the positioning suggested the body had been placed rather than dumped. She was laid on her back, he said, standing in the morgue with X-rays backlit on the viewing screen. Arms at her sides, almost respectful. Detective Vance found that word, respectful, deeply unsettling. Nothing about murder was respectful, but she understood what Dr. Holland meant. The crime scene suggested contradiction, a careful disposal that implied both guilt and something else, something harder to name, remorse maybe, or ritual. The fracture to Sarah's skull was severe, radiating from the occipital bone in a starburst pattern. Dr. Holland estimated the force required would have been substantial, equivalent to a fall from significant height or a blow from something heavy and blunt. This injury alone would have caused death within minutes, he explained, tracing the fracture lines with a gloved finger. Massive intracranial hemorrhage, brainstem trauma. She wouldn't have suffered long. But it was the other marks that generated the most debate. 7 of Sarah's ribs showed parallel scoring, grooves carved into the bone surface with enough force to leave permanent impressions. Her left scapula had similar marks, 3 distinct lines running diagonally across the shoulder blade. Dr. Holland had seen knife wounds, saw injuries, even damage from industrial equipment. These marks matched none of those patterns. "The spacing is inconsistent with any tool I'm familiar with," he said, his professional detachment starting to crack, "and the depth varies in a way that suggests organic pressure, not mechanical." A forensic anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, Dr. Rebecca Morse, was brought in for consultation. She'd spent 20 years studying trauma patterns in skeletal remains, including animal predation and scavenging damage. When she examined Sarah's bones, she went very quiet for a very long time. "These marks were made peri-mortem," she finally said, using the clinical term for injuries occurring at or near the time of death. "They're not post-mortem animal activity. The bone shows no healing, no remodeling. Whatever caused this happened when she was still alive or immediately after death." Detective Vance asked the obvious question. Could an animal have done this? Dr. Morse hesitated. "The pattern isn't consistent with any native species. Black bears have claws that could potentially create scoring like this, but the spacing is wrong. Too narrow in some places, too wide in others. Cougars and bobcats have much smaller claws, and their attack patterns are different. They go for the throat and skull, not the torso. These marks are almost methodical, like something was testing resistance or exploring. What about a person with a weapon? Possible. But what kind of weapon leaves marks like this? Not a knife, the grooves are too curved, almost tapered. Not a tool, the depth variation suggests something with give, not rigid metal or wood." Dr. Morse pulled up comparison photos on her laptop, images of bear claw marks on trees and documented animal attacks on humans. None of them matched. "I can tell you what it's not," she said. "I can't tell you what it is." The investigation began tracing everyone who'd had access to the maintenance building in late 1993. University employment records revealed 18 people worked in or around that facility: custodians, electricians, groundskeepers, a building supervisor. 5 of those individuals had died in the intervening years. 7 had moved out of state. The remaining 6 were interviewed extensively. Most of them barely remembered the renovation project, let alone specific details about wall panels or storage spaces. One former electrician, a man named Carl Desmond, who now lived in Tennessee, recalled something odd. "There was this smell," Carl said over the phone, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. "Late November, maybe early December '93. I was running new conduit through the basement and I noticed this smell near the east wall. Kind of sweet but wrong, you know. Like meat gone bad but with chemicals mixed in. I reported it to my supervisor, thought maybe a raccoon died in the walls. He said he'd handle it. Next time I came back, the smell was gone and there was fresh plywood on that wall. I figured they'd found the dead animal and sealed it up." Detective Vance felt her stomach turn. "You didn't investigate further?" "Wasn't my job. Supervisor said it was handled. I trusted him." The supervisor Carl mentioned was a man named Eugene Hartwell, who'd been the head of facilities maintenance from 1987 to 1998. Eugene had died in 2006 from a heart attack, taking whatever he knew with him. His personnel file revealed nothing unusual: satisfactory performance reviews, no disciplinary actions, a quiet career of keeping buildings functional. But Detective Vance noticed something interesting in the timeline. Eugene had retired abruptly in 1998, taking early retirement at age 57 with a reduced pension. The official reason was health concerns. No details specified. Eugene's widow, Margaret Hartwell, still lived in Richmond, now in her early 80s, and residing in an assisted living facility. Detective Vance visited her on a grey afternoon in May, bringing flowers and a gentleness she didn't always have to summon for interviews. Margaret was sharp, her memory clear, though her hands shook when she poured tea. "Eugene changed after that girl disappeared," Margaret said without preamble, as if she'd been waiting years to tell someone. "He wasn't the same. Started having nightmares, drinking more. He'd never been a heavy drinker, maybe a beer on weekends. But after '93, I'd find bottles hidden in the garage, in his toolbox. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd find him sitting in the living room with all the lights on, just staring at nothing." "Did he ever talk about what was bothering him?" Margaret's eyes grew distant. "Once. It was maybe 1997. We were at our daughter's house for Christmas. Eugene had too much wine and he got quiet. You know how some people do when they drink, inward. Our son-in-law asked him if something was wrong, and Eugene said, 'Sometimes you see things you can't unsee. Sometimes you make choices and you don't know if they were right.' Nobody knew what he meant. We thought it was just the wine talking. Mrs. Hartwell, do you think your husband knew what happened to Sarah Garrett?" The old woman's hands stopped shaking. She met Detective Vance's eyes directly. "I think my husband found something he didn't know how to explain, and I think it terrified him for the rest of his life." The investigation expanded. Detective Vance obtained a warrant to search Eugene Hartwell's storage unit, which Margaret said had remained sealed since his death, filled with his tools and work documents. Among boxes of maintenance manuals and old invoices, they found a locked metal case, the kind used for important documents. It took a locksmith 30 minutes to open it. Inside were 3 items: a university master key from 1993, a Polaroid photograph, and a handwritten note on yellow legal paper. The photograph showed the interior of the maintenance building basement, specifically the east wall before the plywood panel was installed. The image was dark, lit only by a work light, but clear enough to see the exposed space and what appeared to be something wrapped in tarp at the bottom. The photo had no date stamp, but the aging and color saturation suggested it was from the early 1990s. The handwritten note was more disturbing. Eugene's handwriting, confirmed by comparison to his personnel file signature, covered half a page in cramped, uneven letters. "I sealed it. God forgive me, I sealed it. She was already gone when I found her, already cold. The smell led me there Thursday morning. I should have called police, but I saw the marks and I didn't know what made them. Couldn't have been a person. Couldn't have been an animal. I looked up and saw scratches on the ceiling beams, 8 feet up, fresh wood showing through. Footprints in the dust, too big, wrong shape. I panicked. Thought if I reported it, they'd blame me or think I was crazy. I wrapped her up and sealed the wall. Told myself I was protecting the family from publicity, from scandal. Truth is, I was scared. I'm still scared. What was down there with her? What did I seal in?" The note ended there. No signature, no date. Just Eugene Hartwell's confession, locked away for 18 years after his death. Detective Vance read it 3 times, each time feeling the narrative of the case shift like sand. Eugene hadn't killed Sarah, the timeline didn't work, and nothing in his background suggested violence. But he'd found her body, panicked, and made a decision that had buried the truth for 3 decades. The reference to ceiling scratches sent Detective Vance back to the maintenance building. The structure was still standing, now cordoned off as a crime scene. She went down to the basement with a forensic team and high-powered lights. The space where Sarah had been hidden was empty now, just bare concrete and brick. But when they examined the ceiling beams directly above, they found exactly what Eugene had described. 4 parallel grooves cut deep into the wood, running for about 2 feet along a support beam 8 feet above the floor. The wood inside the cuts was still lighter than the surrounding timber, preserved from decades of oxidation by the depth of the scoring. Dr. Paula Chen, the same wildlife forensics expert who'd examined the hunting shack back in 1993, was still working, now semi-retired but consulting on unusual cases. She came to look at the ceiling scratches at Detective Vance's request. Paula was 70 years old now, her hair silver, but her eyes were just as sharp. She climbed a ladder and examined the marks with a magnifying loupe and flashlight. After 20 minutes, she climbed back down slowly. "Well?" Detective Vance asked. "These marks are consistent with the ones I saw at the hunting shack in '93, Paula said carefully. "Same spacing, same depth variation, same curved scoring. I couldn't identify them then, and I can't identify them now. But I can tell you this. Whatever made these marks had significant upper body strength to reach this height and enough force to cut into aged hardwood. A human standing on something could theoretically create marks at this height, but the angle is wrong. These were made by something reaching up, not down." "What does that mean?" Paula looked at her for a long moment. "It means I don't know, and that terrifies me more than having an answer." The forensic team also found footprints in the dust of the basement, preserved beneath years of accumulated dirt and debris. They were concentrated near the hidden compartment, partial impressions that showed unusual characteristics. The size suggested something large, estimated US size 15 or 16 if they were human, but the shape was odd, wider at the toe than typical shoes or boots, with pressure points that didn't match normal human gait. A forensic podiatrist determined the prints were at least 25 years old, consistent with the 1993 timeline, but couldn't conclusively determine what had made them. Detective Vance stood in that basement for hours, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Sarah had been at the library until 6:14 p.m. She'd walked toward the parking lot near this building. Sometime between then and full darkness, maybe an hour window, something had happened. Had she come into this basement voluntarily? Had she been chased? Her sneaker was found 2 miles away at the hunting shack, but her body was here. How did those pieces fit together? A theory emerged, fragmented and incomplete. Sarah had been in the woods that afternoon, based on her journal entry about hearing something moving parallel to her. Maybe she'd returned to campus, gone to the library, then planned to investigate further that evening. Maybe whatever she'd heard in the woods had followed her back. Maybe it had been waiting near the maintenance building when she walked past. The basement had external access doors, old bulkhead-style entrances that were rarely locked in the 1990s. Someone, or something, could have forced her inside. But that theory had problems. Sarah's journal and backpack were never found, except for the journal discovered near the creek 3 days after her disappearance. Had she dropped it while being pursued? Or had someone taken it from her body and placed it there later, trying to mislead investigators? And what about the sneaker at the hunting shack? That suggested she'd been alive and moving through the forest at some point. Unless the sneaker had been planted there too, a false trail, the DNA evidence added another layer. Forensics had tested everything, the tarp, the plastic, the remains themselves, looking for DNA that might identify an attacker. They found Sarah's DNA, obviously. They found trace DNA from Eugene Hartwell on the tarp material, consistent with him handling it while wrapping her body. But they also found something else. Unidentified biological material on Sarah's clothing, specifically on the shoulder area of her sweatshirt. The material was degraded after 30 years, but enough remained for partial analysis. It wasn't human. It wasn't from any animal in the FBI's DNA database. The genetic sequencing showed markers consistent with mammalian DNA, but with anomalies that the lab couldn't explain. The report, written by a geneticist named Dr. Alan Kraft, used careful language. Sample exhibits characteristics of mammalian origin with significant structural variations from known species. Recommend additional testing and comparison to broader genetic databases. Contamination, unlikely given preservation conditions, and control samples. Detective Vance asked Dr. Kraft to explain in plain English. He struggled. "It's like finding a puzzle piece that almost fits, but not quite," he said. "The basic building blocks are there. It's definitely biological, definitely from something with a backbone and warm blood. But the specific genetic markers don't match anything we have on file. It could be a degraded sample from a known animal, DNA damaged by time and environment to the point where we can't recognize it anymore. Or it's from something we haven't catalogued yet, something rare or unidentified. The possibility hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. The forests of Appalachia covered millions of acres, much of it unexplored and unmapped. New species were discovered every year, usually insects or small reptiles, but occasionally larger animals. In the 1990s, trail cameras and DNA analysis weren't as common. Something could have existed in those woods without scientific documentation. Could still exist. But that rational explanation didn't account for the methodical way Sarah's body had been hidden, the careful wrapping, the sealed wall. Animals didn't do that. Only humans planned and concealed like that. Which brought the investigation back to the possibility of a human perpetrator, someone who'd killed Sarah. And then, what? Tried to make it look like an animal attack? Staged the scene to create confusion? Detective Vance conducted interviews with everyone still living who'd known Sarah in 1993. Her parents had both passed away in the intervening years, never knowing what had happened to their daughter. Jennifer Pace, the former roommate, agreed to speak again. She flew to Kentucky from Oregon, where she now lived with her family. Over coffee in a Richmond diner, Jennifer looked at photos from the investigation, carefully selected, nothing too graphic, and tried to find anything that sparked recognition. "Sarah talked about something once," Jennifer said slowly, stirring sugar into her coffee without drinking. "It was maybe a week before she disappeared. We were in our dorm room late at night, couldn't sleep, just talking about random stuff. She told me she thought there were parts of the forest that people shouldn't go, places that had their own, I don't know, she used the word sovereignty, like the forest had territory that it protected. I asked her what she meant and she kind of laughed it off, said she was being poetic. But I don't think she was. I think she'd seen something or felt something out there that made her believe that." "Did she seem scared?" "No. That's what was weird. She seemed more respectful, like she'd learned a rule and intended to follow it. She said the forest would leave you alone if you left it alone, but if you pushed too far, if you disrespected the boundary, it would push back." Jennifer started crying then. Quiet tears she wiped away with a paper napkin. "I should have asked more questions, should have known something was wrong. But Sarah always talked like that, you know. Poetic and mystical about nature. I didn't think it was a warning. I thought it was just Sarah being Sarah. Could that sense of being watched have been real? Or was it just the forest playing tricks on her mind?" The investigation into Sarah Garrett's death became something more than a typical cold case. Detective Vance felt it in the way people responded when she asked questions, the way their eyes would shift or their voices would drop. There was something about this case that touched on fears people didn't like to acknowledge, things that lived in the space between known and unknown. Richmond was a college town, modern and connected, but it sat on the edge of wilderness that had been old when the first settlers arrived. And old places have long memories. She started digging into historical records, looking for patterns. The Daniel Boone National Forest had its share of missing persons cases over the decades. Hikers who'd wandered off trails, hunters who never returned, the occasional tourist underestimating the terrain. Most were eventually found, victims of falls or exposure or simple bad luck. But there were outliers, cases that remained unsolved, people who'd vanished completely. Detective Vance found 7 cases between 1970 and 1993 that shared certain characteristics. All were solo hikers or campers, all disappeared in autumn or early winter, and all were last seen near the eastern sections of the forest, the same general area where Sarah had gone missing. None of those cases had been officially connected. Different jurisdictions, different lead investigators, years between incidents. But when Vance laid them out on a timeline, a pattern emerged. Roughly every 3 to 4 years, someone disappeared without explanation. The gaps weren't exact, sometimes 5 years, once only 2, but consistent enough to be noticeable. She brought this to her lieutenant, a man named Frank Morrison, who'd been with Richmond PD for 26 years. He looked at her timeline and frowned. "You think we've got a serial killer who's been operating for 50 years?" Frank asked, skeptical but not dismissive. "I don't know what we have," Vance admitted. "But I think something has been happening in those woods for a long time, and we've been treating each incident as isolated, when maybe they're not." Frank authorized her to contact the other jurisdictions, share information, look for connections. Most of the original investigators had retired or died, but case files still existed. A detective in Jackson County sent over materials from a 1987 disappearance. A bow hunter named Robert Chen who'd gone into the forest one October morning and never came out. His truck was found at a trailhead, his bow discovered 2 days later near a limestone bluff, still strung and ready. But Robert himself was never found. The case file included photos of the area where his bow was discovered. On a nearby tree trunk, about 6 feet up, someone had documented deep scratches in the bark. 4 parallel grooves running vertically. Detective Vance felt her pulse quicken. She requested the physical evidence from that case, but was told it had been destroyed in a storage facility fire in 2003. Only the photographs remained. She compared them to the photos from Sarah's case, the hunting shack marks from 1993, the ceiling beam scratches from the maintenance building. The spacing wasn't identical, but the pattern was similar enough to be unsettling. 4 parallel lines, consistent depth, carved into wood with significant force. A retired park ranger named William Cross agreed to meet with Detective Vance at a cafe in town. William had worked the Daniel Boone National Forest from 1978 until his retirement in 2005. Nearly 3 decades of patrolling trails and responding to emergencies. He was 72 now, weathered and lean, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains he'd spent his life protecting. When Detective Vance showed him the photos of the scratch marks, William went very still. "I've seen marks like that," he said quietly. "More than once. We always logged them as bear activity in our reports. Black bears marking territory, establishing dominance. That's what we were trained to say. But you didn't believe it." William chose his words carefully. "I worked those woods for almost 30 years. I've seen bear marks on hundreds of trees. These aren't the same. Bears leave claw marks when they stretch, when they're marking scent, when they're stripping bark to eat the cambium layer underneath. The pattern is distinctive. 5 claws usually, sometimes 4 if one doesn't contact, spread wide, often accompanied by bite marks or fur. These marks you're showing me, they're different, too deliberate, too clean, and they're always in places that don't make sense for bear behavior." "What do you mean?" "Bears don't typically mark territory inside buildings. They don't scratch ceiling beams 8 feet up when there's easier territory markers available at ground level. And the spacing is wrong. Too narrow for a large bear, too wide for a small one. It's like..." He paused, seeming embarrassed. "It's like something trying to make bear marks but not quite getting it right. Or something that's similar to a bear but not exactly." Detective Vance felt a chill despite the warm cafe. "In your 30 years, did you ever see anything in those woods that you couldn't explain?" William was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Twice. Once in 1981, I was doing a solo patrol in a remote section near the shelter we trace. It was late afternoon, autumn, sun starting to drop. I heard something moving parallel to me through the trees, maybe 50 yards off the trail. Large, bipedal, I could tell by the rhythm of the footfalls. I assumed it was another hiker, maybe someone lost. I called out, identified myself as a ranger. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard this sound, this kind of low rumble that wasn't quite animal, but wasn't human either. Like someone trying to growl, but with vocal cords that weren't shaped right. The hair on my neck stood up. I drew my sidearm. We carried 357 revolvers back then, and moved toward the sound. Found footprints in the mud near a creek. Big, bare footprints, but the toes were wrong. Too long, too splayed. I radioed it in, called it a possible lost hiker with foot injuries, but I knew it wasn't. What was the second time? 1998, November. I responded to a report of a missing camper near the Red River Gorge area. We found his campsite intact, fire still smoldering, food hanging in a bear bag untouched. His sleeping bag was shredded, torn to pieces. There was blood on the ground. Not much, but enough. We followed a blood trail about a quarter-mile into thick forest, and then it just ended, like he'd been picked up and carried. Found one of his boots hanging from a branch about 9 feet off the ground, wedged there like it had been placed. We searched for 3 weeks. Never found him. The official report said possible animal attack, probable mountain lion or black bear, remains scattered by scavengers. But I've seen animal attacks. They're messy, chaotic. This was something else. This felt intentional. Detective Vance asked if he'd reported these observations officially. Williams smiled sadly. You learn pretty quickly what you can say and what you can't. You report weird footprints and unexplained sounds. You get labeled as the crazy ranger who believes in Bigfoot. Your reports stop being taken seriously. Your career suffers. So you stick to the script: bear activity, possible cougar, natural predation. You document what you're supposed to document, and you keep the rest to yourself. But you remember. God knows you remember. The conversation stayed with Detective Vance for days. She'd entered law enforcement believing in evidence, in rational explanations, in the knowable world. But this case was pushing her into territory where evidence pointed toward things that shouldn't exist. She decided to consult with a cryptozoologist, a decision she knew might damage her credibility if it became public. She found Dr. Nathan Reeves, a primatologist who'd spent 20 years researching reports of unidentified primates in North America while maintaining academic respectability through his published work on known species. Dr. Reeves agreed to review the evidence without publicity. He examined the photographs, the DNA report, the witness statements, the pattern of disappearances. His analysis was both fascinating and frustrating. If I'm being honest, he said during a video call, his office shelves lined with books and skulls behind him, you have a collection of evidence that's consistent with predation by a large, intelligent animal that's not currently recognized by science. The scratch marks, the footprints, the DNA anomalies, the behavior pattern, they all fit a profile. But I can't tell you what that animal is, because we don't have a specimen, we don't have clear footage, we don't have remains. What's your theory? My theory? There are approximately 8 million species on this planet, and we've only formally identified about 1.5 million of them. Most undiscovered species are small. Insects, microorganisms, deep-sea creatures. But occasionally we find larger animals we didn't know existed. The Saola, a forest-dwelling bovine in Vietnam, wasn't discovered until 1992. If there are unknown megafauna hiding in Southeast Asian jungles, why not in Appalachia? We're talking about one of the largest temperate forests in the world, hundreds of thousands of acres that are barely touched by humans. Something could exist there, especially if it's rare, nocturnal, and intelligent enough to avoid detection. You're talking about Bigfoot. Dr. Reeves smiled. I'm talking about the possibility of an unidentified primate or bear species that's adapted to deep forest environments and has learned to avoid human contact. Whether you want to call that Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or wood ape is semantics. The question isn't whether it matches folklore. The question is whether the evidence supports the existence of something unknown. And in this case, I'd say the evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What would you need for it to be conclusive? Bones. Clear photographs. Multiple reliable witnesses observing the same creature. Physical evidence that can be definitively analyzed and compared. You have fragments of all of those things, but nothing that would convince a skeptical scientific community. Which means, professionally, I can't confirm anything, but personally. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Personally, I think something is in those woods, and I think it killed Sarah Garrett." Detective Vance ended the call feeling more unsettled than before. She had two competing narratives now. The rational explanation: Sarah had been killed by a person, possibly Eugene Hartwell, though the timeline was problematic, or someone else who'd used the confusion around animal marks to cover their crime. The body was hidden, evidence was staged or misinterpreted, and 30 years of speculation had turned a tragic murder into something mysterious. The alternative explanation: Sarah had encountered something in the woods, something large and unknown, possibly the same thing she'd heard moving parallel to her trail that afternoon. It had followed her back to campus, or had been there waiting. In the basement of the maintenance building in the dark, Sarah had died, whether from a fall, a deliberate attack, or defensive action gone wrong. Eugene Hartwell had found her body the next morning, had seen the marks and the scratches and the impossible footprints, had panicked and made a choice to seal it away rather than face questions he couldn't answer. Both explanations had problems. The rational theory couldn't account for the DNA evidence, the consistency of the scratch marks across multiple sites and decades, or the pattern of similar disappearances. The alternative theory required accepting something that mainstream science said didn't exist: a creature that had somehow avoided definitive documentation despite thousands of hikers and hunters passing through its territory every year. Detective Vance decided to revisit the hunting shack where Sarah's sneaker had been found in 1993. The location was still marked in the original case files, GPS coordinates that would lead her there. She went on a cool morning in early June, taking a deputy named Marcus Riley with her for safety. They parked at a Forest Service road and hiked in, following the coordinates through terrain that had changed little in 30 years. The trees were older, the undergrowth thicker, but the bones of the land remained the same. The hunting shack was still there, barely. The roof had completely collapsed, and 3 of the 4 walls had buckled inward. But the north wall, the one with the scratch marks from 1993, still stood partially intact. Detective Vance approached it carefully, mindful of rotting timber and rusty nails. The scratches were still visible, weathered and filled with moss now, but unmistakable. She placed her hand against them, feeling the depth of the grooves. Something had put significant force into this wood, enough to carve through bark and deep into the timber beneath. Deputy Riley was examining the area around the shack, moving in a slow circle. "Detective," he called out, "you should see this." She found him about 20 feet from the shack, crouched near a massive oak tree. The base of the tree showed scratch marks similar to the ones on the shack wall, but these were fresh, the exposed wood still pale, sap still visible and sticky. "These are recent," Marcus said, touching them gently with a gloved finger. "Within the last few months, maybe. Same pattern as the old ones, 4 parallel lines deep scoring." Detective Vance felt her heart rate increase. She pulled out her phone and documented the marks with photos and video, including measurements with a tape measure for scale. The scratches were 8 inches long, spaced about 2 inches apart, carved into the oak at approximately shoulder height for an average human, but the angle suggested something reaching forward rather than standing directly in front of the tree. They expanded their search, moving in careful patterns through the surrounding forest. 50 yards from the shack, they found more evidence. A small clearing, maybe 15 feet across, where the undergrowth had been flattened in a circular pattern. In the center of the clearing were the remains of a recent fire, cold ash and partially burned wood, but arranged around the fire were bones, deer bones mostly, clean and stripped, some cracked open for marrow. And on a nearby rock, as if placed deliberately, was a human item, a camping fork, bent and twisted, the metal showing tooth marks. "What the hell is this?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Detective Vance didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about tool use, about intelligence, about the line between animal and something more. Bears didn't make fires. They didn't arrange bones in patterns. They didn't bend metal utensils and leave them displayed like trophies or warnings. "Call it in," she said quietly. "I want a full forensic team out here. I want everything documented and collected." The forensic analysis of the new evidence took weeks. The scratch marks on the oak tree were definitively recent, dated to sometime in the last 3 to 4 months based on sap oxidation and tissue healing in the tree. The pattern matched the historical scratches within acceptable variance, similar spacing, similar depth, similar curved scoring. The bones in the clearing were confirmed as white-tailed deer, multiple individuals, aged between 2 weeks and 3 months based on decomposition and weathering. The fire had been made using local wood and appears to have been used multiple times, with layers of ash suggesting repeated use over several months. The camping fork was the most disturbing piece. It was a standard folding utensil, probably from a backpacker's mess kit made of stainless steel. The metal had been bent at a 90-degree angle with enough force to stress the grain of the steel, and the tines showed clear bite impressions. A forensic odontologist examined the marks and determined they were inconsistent with human dentition. The spacing was too wide, the force too great, and the shape suggested canine teeth longer and more curved than human or known animal patterns. "I can tell you this wasn't done by a person," the odontologist Dr. Lauren Shu reported. "The bite force required to deform steel like this would be in excess of 800 psi, possibly more. That's comparable to a large bear or big cat. But the tooth impressions don't match either of those species. The canines are too pronounced, and there's evidence of what looks like premolar contact that's positioned wrong for any bear or cat I'm familiar with." Detective Vance returned to the maintenance building basement one more time, this time with a specialized lighting unit and a forensic photographer. They documented every inch of the space, looking for anything that had been missed in previous examinations. In the far corner, behind where Sarah's body had been hidden, they found something that made everything click into a terrible focus. Scratched into the brick wall, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were marks that matched the pattern from the ceiling beam and the tree scratches. But these were different in one crucial way. They were arranged in groups, repeating patterns that almost looked like tally marks or some kind of counting system. 5 groups of 4 vertical lines, each group crossed by a diagonal 5th line. 20 marks total, made with claws or something claw-like. Scratched into brick with deliberate repetition. Detective Vance stood in that basement, her flashlight illuminating those marks, and felt understanding wash over her like cold water. These weren't random scratches. These weren't territorial markers or accidental damage. These were intentional, counted, purposeful. Something had been down here in this basement, possibly multiple times. Something that could count. The implications were staggering. Animals didn't count. They didn't make tallies or track numbers. That was human behavior, cognitive behavior that required abstract thinking and symbolic representation. But if a person had made these marks, why use this method? Why scratch into brick with enough force to score the surface when they could have used any tool, any marker, any easier method? She photographed the marks extensively, then called in Dr. Rebecca Morse, the forensic anthropologist, and Dr. Nathan Reeves, the primatologist, for a joint consultation. The 3 of them stood in that basement looking at the tally marks and had a conversation that Detective Vance knew would sound insane to anyone not standing in that space with them. "Chimpanzees can count," Dr. Reeves said quietly. "Some gorillas have demonstrated numerical understanding. Crows can count up to 5. It's not unprecedented in the animal kingdom. But this," he gestured at the marks, "this suggests not just counting ability, but the need to track or record something. That's a different level of cognition." "Could a person have made these trying to simulate animal marks?" Detective Vance asked, still clinging to rational explanation. Dr. Morse shook her head. "Look at the depth and angle. These were made by something with immense grip strength, probably using their actual nails or claws while bracing against the wall. A human could theoretically do it with a tool, but why would they? And the placement. These are at about 6.5 feet high, awkward height for a human to work at, but natural for something taller reaching forward. So what are you saying?" Dr. Reeves exhaled slowly. "I'm saying that all the evidence, the DNA, the scratch marks, the footprints, the behavioral patterns, now these tally marks, points to something that's biologically similar to known animals, but cognitively more advanced. Something that's intelligent enough to count, to avoid detection, to establish territory, and possibly to understand that hiding evidence is beneficial. That's not a bear. That's not a cougar. That's something we don't have a name for. Is it possible we're sharing these mountains with something we've refused to believe in, or are we seeing patterns where there are none? The discovery of the tally marks in the maintenance building basement changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Detective Vance found herself standing at a crossroads between two versions of reality, and the physical evidence refused to definitively choose one path over the other. She spent 3 days reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every photograph and lab report, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. What emerged was something more complicated than a simple murder case, more troubling than a straightforward animal attack. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A forensic genealogist named Dr. Simon Park, who'd been analyzing the unidentified DNA found on Sarah's clothing, contacted Detective Vance with results from an expanded genetic database search. "I can't give you a species match," he said over the phone, his voice tight with frustration and fascination, "but I can tell you something interesting about the genetic markers. The sample shows characteristics consistent with a member of the family Hominidae, that's great apes and humans. But it's not human, not chimpanzee, not gorilla, not orangutan, not any of the known species. It's something else, something that shares a common ancestor with us, but diverged along a different evolutionary path. How is that possible? Wouldn't we know if there was another hominid species alive? We thought Homo sapiens were alone until we discovered Denisovans through DNA analysis in 2010, and we only know they existed because we found bones in a Siberian cave. Before that, we thought Neanderthals were the last of our evolutionary cousins, and they went extinct 40,000 years ago. But what if they didn't all die out? What if some populations survived in isolated pockets, evolved differently, adapted to deep forest environments where they'd rarely encounter humans? We're talking about millions of acres of wilderness in North America that are essentially unexplored at ground level. The Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, Appalachia, these are some of the most rugged, inhospitable terrains on the continent. Something could hide there. Something has been hiding there. Detective Vance felt dizzy. "You're telling me Bigfoot is real? I'm telling you that the DNA evidence suggests an unclassified hominid species. Whether that matches Native American folklore about Sasquatch or Appalachian legends about wood boogers or any other cultural tradition is beside the point. The genetics don't lie. This sample came from something that's biologically similar to us, but distinct enough to be categorized as a separate species. And based on the other evidence you've shared, the size of the footprints, the scratch marks, the behavioral patterns, we're likely talking about something large, bipedal, possessing significant strength, and at least rudimentary intelligence." The implications cascaded through Detective Vance's mind. If Dr. Park was right, if there really was an unknown hominid species living in the Appalachian forests, then everything about Sarah's case took on a different dimension. This wasn't a murder in the traditional sense. This was a tragic encounter between two species, one documented and one hidden, in a space where their territories overlapped. She brought her findings to Lieutenant Morrison, laying out everything: the DNA analysis, the pattern of disappearances, the tally marks, the witness statements from park rangers and hunters over the decades. Frank listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each piece of evidence. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "If we go public with this," he finally said, "if we tell the world that Sarah Garrett was killed by an unknown primate species, we'll be laughed out of law enforcement. The case will become a joke. Her family will never have closure because nobody will take it seriously. But if we don't tell the truth is, we have physical evidence of an attack by something we can't identify," Frank interrupted. "The truth is, a young woman died 31 years ago, and her body was hidden by a maintenance supervisor who panicked. The truth is, we can document what happened without speculating about what caused it. We can give her family answers without making claims we can't prove." Detective Vance understood the political reality, but it felt like cowardice. "So we just ignore the evidence that points to something else? We present the evidence and let people draw their own conclusions. We say the DNA is from an unidentified source. We note the unusual scratch marks and footprints. We acknowledge that the circumstances suggest an animal encounter of some kind, but we don't stand up at a press conference and say, 'Bigfoot killed Sarah Garrett.' We can't. Not without a body, not without definitive proof." It was a compromise that satisfied no one but served everyone. Detective Vance drafted a report that was simultaneously complete and evasive, documenting every piece of evidence while carefully avoiding conclusions that would invite ridicule. The official finding, released in July 2024, stated that Sarah Lynn Garrett had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head, likely occurring during an encounter with an unknown animal in or near the maintenance building on the evening of October 21, 1993. The body had been discovered and subsequently concealed by Eugene Hartwell, facilities supervisor, who had died in 2006 without reporting the incident. The case was classified as death by misadventure, with contributing factors of improper body disposal and obstruction of justice by a deceased party. The press conference was surreal. Detective Vance stood at a podium with microphones pointed at her like accusations, answering questions while trying to navigate between truth and incredulity. Yes, there was unidentified DNA. No, they couldn't determine the species. Yes, there were unusual markings at the scene. No, they couldn't conclusively say what made them. Yes, they had evidence suggesting Sarah had an encounter with something in the woods. No, they couldn't confirm what that something was. The reporters pressed for details. The phrase "Bigfoot killing" appeared in several headlines, always with a tone of mockery or skepticism. But buried in the later paragraphs of those articles, journalists who'd actually read the evidence report noted the troubling consistency of the physical evidence, the DNA anomalies, the pattern of similar incidents. A few took it seriously. Most didn't. Sarah's surviving family, 2 cousins and an aunt who'd never stopped searching for answers, received a private briefing. Detective Vance sat with them in a conference room and told them everything, holding nothing back. She showed them the evidence, the photos, the lab reports. She explained both interpretations. The rational explanation that someone had killed Sarah and staged it to look like an animal attack, and the alternative explanation that something unknown had been responsible. Sarah's aunt, a woman named Patricia Garrett, who was now in her 70s, listened with tears streaming down her face. When Detective Vance finished, Patricia asked one question. Did she suffer? The medical examiner believes the head injury would have caused rapid loss of consciousness, Detective Vance said gently. Whatever happened, it was quick. She wouldn't have suffered long. Patricia nodded slowly. Sarah loved those woods. She felt safe there, felt like she belonged. If something in the forest took her, maybe that's not the worst way she could have gone. Does that sound crazy? No, ma'am. It doesn't sound crazy at all. The case was officially closed in August 2024, 31 years and 10 months after Sarah disappeared. But closing a case didn't mean ending the questions. Detective Vance couldn't stop thinking about those tally marks in the basement, 20 deliberate scratches counted out with purpose. She returned to the maintenance building one final time before it was demolished, standing in that basement with only a flashlight and her thoughts. What had those marks meant? 20 days? 20 visits? 20 of something else? And why had Eugene Hartwell sealed this space, hiding Sarah's body, but also hiding whatever had made those marks? Had he seen something down here that terrified him so badly he chose concealment over truth? His note suggested he had, what was down there with her? What did I seal in? But nothing had been sealed in. The basement had external access, old bulkhead doors that opened to the outside. Whatever had been here could have left any time. Unless the tally marks had been made before Sarah died, scratched into the wall over days or weeks by something that had claimed this space as temporary shelter. Something that had been living underneath the campus, using the basement as a den or way station, until the night Sarah stumbled into its territory. Detective Vance constructed a timeline in her mind, piecing together fragments into a narrative that fit the evidence. Sarah had been in the woods that afternoon, researching her thesis when she'd heard something moving parallel to her on the trail, something large, bipedal, watching her. She'd noted it in her journal with scientific detachment, planning to investigate further. She'd returned to campus, spent hours in the library, then decided to check the woods one more time before dark. But instead of going back into the forest, maybe she'd heard something near the maintenance building, something that drew her attention. The basement doors would have been unlocked, as they usually were in 1993. Maybe she'd seen movement, heard sounds, and her scientific curiosity had overridden her caution. She'd gone down those stairs into the darkness, and something had been waiting there. Something that had been using that space, that had marked the walls 20 times for reasons only it understood. The encounter had been sudden, violent, probably defensive. Sarah had suffered the fatal head injury, a fall backward onto concrete, a strike from something panicked or territorial, impossible to know which. Her death had been quick, as the medical examiner said. And then, what? Had the creature understood what it had done? Had it hidden her body in the concealed space, wrapping her carefully, showing that strange respect that Eugene had noted? Or had Eugene found the scene the next morning, found Sarah's body and the evidence of something impossible, and made the choice to seal it all away? The second scenario seemed more likely. Eugene had hidden Sarah and whatever truth had died with her, then spent the rest of his life haunted by the choice. The creature, if that's what it was, had abandoned the basement after that night, moving deeper into the forest, continuing the pattern of rare but devastating encounters with humans who ventured too far into its territory. But Sarah's sneaker at the hunting shack, her journal by the creek, those pieces still didn't fit cleanly. Had she dropped them earlier during her afternoon hike? Or had something carried them there afterward, leaving traces across miles of forest in a pattern that suggested either random scattering or deliberate misdirection? The latter possibility was the most disturbing because it implied planning, intelligence, an understanding of how to confuse a search. Dr. Reeves, the primatologist, offered one final observation when Detective Vance consulted him about the tally marks. "Great apes have been observed engaging in ritualistic behavior," he said. "Chimpanzees make rock piles at certain trees, throwing stones and creating accumulations that serve no obvious purpose. Some researchers believe it's a form of proto-religious behavior, marking sacred spaces or important locations. If your unknown hominid was making tally marks, it might have been tracking something, days, visits, kills, or it might have been engaging in ritual behavior we can't interpret. Either way, it suggests a level of abstract thinking that's remarkable and terrifying." The maintenance building was demolished in September 2024. Detective Vance attended, watching from a safe distance as excavators tore into the old structure, reducing it to rubble and twisted rebar. The basement where Sarah had been hidden, where something had scratched 20 marks into brick, was filled with concrete and buried under tons of earth. A new building would rise on the site, modern and clean, with no memory of what had come before. But the forest remained. The Daniel Boone National Forest still pressed against the eastern edge of campus, still offered its trails to hikers and its shadows to whatever lived in them. Detective Vance drove out there one cool morning in October, parking at a trailhead and walking into the trees alone. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Closure, maybe, or understanding, or just the need to stand in the space where Sarah had spent her last happy hours. The forest in autumn was beautiful, all gold and red, and the smell of decay that fed new growth. Birds called from the canopy. Somewhere distant, a creek rushed over stones. Detective Vance walked for an hour, following a marked trail until she reached a ridge that overlooked miles of unbroken woodland. The view was breathtaking, layered hills stretching to the horizon, thousands of acres where humans rarely walked and secrets could hide for decades or centuries. She heard it then, a sound that made her freeze. Heavy footfalls, moving through the trees about 50 yards to her left, cracking branches and disturbing undergrowth. Something large, moving with deliberate purpose, not running, not charging, just walking parallel to her position. She turned slowly, hand instinctively moving to her sidearm, scanning the tree line. Nothing visible, just shadows and distance and the sound of movement. Then, as abruptly as it started, silence, complete and total, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Detective Vance waited, her heart hammering, every sense heightened. She thought about Sarah standing in this same forest 31 years earlier, hearing the same sound, making the same calculation about danger and curiosity. The moment stretched. Then a bird called, breaking the spell, and the normal sounds of the forest resumed. Whatever had been there, if anything had been there, was gone. Detective Vance stood on that ridge for another 10 minutes, but the sound didn't return. She walked back to her car slowly, checking over her shoulder more than once, feeling watched but never seeing anything. She would never know if it had been real or imagined, deer or something else, coincidence or message. But she understood, standing in that parking lot with dirt on her boots and adrenaline still coursing through her veins, why Sarah had kept going back to these woods. There was something here, whether it was the presence of an unknown species or just the weight of wilderness itself, something that reminded you how small you were, how much you didn't know, how thin the boundary was between the explained and the inexplicable. A memorial service for Sarah Lynn Garrett was held at Eastern Kentucky University in November 2024, 31 years after her disappearance. More than 200 people attended, former classmates who'd never forgotten, professors who'd taught her, strangers who'd followed the case and felt connected to her story. They planted a red maple tree near the campus commons, placing a bronze plaque at its base. Sarah Lynn Garrett, 1972-1993. She found peace in the wild places. Jennifer Pace, the former roommate, spoke at the service. Sarah taught me that nature isn't just scenery, she said, her voice carrying across the quiet crowd. It's alive, it's aware, and it operates by rules we don't fully understand. She respected that. She loved that. And I think in the end that's how she would want to be remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who spent her life trying to understand the mystery, even if the mystery was bigger than her. Detective Vance attended the service but didn't speak. She stood in the back, watching the ceremony, carrying the weight of everything she knew and couldn't say. The case was closed on paper, but it lived on in the questions that had no complete answers. What really happened in that basement? What made those marks, left that DNA, counted 20 scratches into brick? Was it a person staging an elaborate deception or something else, something the world wasn't ready to acknowledge? The official narrative said Sarah died in a tragic encounter with an unidentified animal, her body hidden by a panicked supervisor who took his guilt to the grave. That narrative was tidy, legally sufficient, politically safe. But the unofficial narrative, the one that lived in the case files and the forensic reports and the memories of everyone who'd seen the evidence firsthand, told a different story. It told of something that lived in the margins of human experience, something that shared these mountains with us but stayed just out of sight, revealing itself only in moments of tragic overlap. William Cross, the retired park ranger, died in December 2024 at age 72. His obituary mentioned his decades of service to the Daniel Boone National Forest, his dedication to conservation, his love of wilderness. It didn't mention the things he'd seen in those woods, the sounds he'd heard, the footprints he'd documented and labeled as bear activity, because that was the only acceptable explanation. But Detective Vance attended his funeral and heard the stories his family told, the way he'd always been drawn back to the forest even in retirement, the way he'd insisted that the woods had their own intelligence, their own rules, their own inhabitants that humans only glimpsed at the edges of comprehension. In January 2025, a wildlife camera set up by researchers studying white-tailed deer captured something unusual on the eastern edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest. The footage showed a figure moving through trees at night, caught for only 4 seconds of grainy infrared video. It was large, bipedal, moving with a gait that wasn't quite human, but wasn't quite animal either. The researchers sent the footage to multiple experts for analysis. Opinions varied. A bear on hind legs, a person in costume, a hoax, an artifact of image compression. Dr. Nathan Reeves examined it and said only, "Inconclusive, but intriguing." The footage circulated online for a week, generated debate and mockery in equal measure, then faded from attention like all the other ambiguous evidence that came before it. Detective Vance kept a copy of the video on her laptop, watched it sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep. 4 seconds of something moving through darkness, there and then gone, offering no answers but asking endless questions. She thought about Sarah often, about the journal entry describing something moving parallel to her trail, about the choice to investigate rather than retreat, about the thin line between scientific curiosity and fatal mistake. The Daniel Boone National Forest covers more than 700,000 acres. At any given time, fewer than 1,000 people are in it, scattered across hundreds of square miles. Most stay on marked trails, camp in designated areas, follow the rules designed to keep them safe. But some venture deeper, drawn by the same impulse that drove Sarah, the desire to see what's beyond the next ridge, to know what lies in the spaces between human understanding. Some of them come back with stories. Most don't tell those stories, knowing they'll be dismissed or ridiculed. But the stories exist, passed quietly between hikers and hunters and rangers, shared in online forums under anonymous usernames, whispered over campfires when the night gets deep enough. Stories of heavy footfalls in the darkness. Stories of shadows that move wrong. Stories of feeling watched from the tree line, of finding footprints too large to be human, of hearing calls that don't match any known animal. Are they all imagination? Misidentification? The human tendency to see patterns in randomness, to populate the unknown with monsters? Maybe. Probably. But Sarah Garrett was real. Her DNA evidence was real. The scratch marks in the basement and the hunting shack and the oak tree were real. The unidentified genetic material was real. And 31 years of questions couldn't be dismissed as imagination or hoax or natural misunderstanding. Something happened in those woods and in that basement. Something that ended a young woman's life and haunted everyone who tried to understand it. Whether that something was a human monster hiding behind staged animal evidence, or an unknown species defending its territory, or something stranger that exists in the space between those explanations. That question remains open. The case is closed, but the truth, whatever it is, still walks those hills. Detective Sarah Vance sometimes drives out to the forest at dusk, parks at a trailhead and just listens. She hears wind in the trees, birds settling for the night, the distant sounds of a wilderness that was old before humans named it. And sometimes, if she's honest with herself, she hears something else. Something moving just beyond sight, something that knows these woods better than she ever will. Something that watches and waits and reminds her that not everything can be solved, not everything can be known, not everything fits into a case file and a courtroom narrative. Sarah Lynn Garrett is finally at rest, her remains cremated and scattered by her family in a private ceremony at a location they chose not to disclose. The investigation is complete, the reports filed, the evidence archived. But the forest keeps its secrets, and the questions linger like fog in a hollow, refusing to fully lift. On clear nights, students at Eastern Kentucky University sometimes walk past the new building that stands where the old maintenance facility once was, unaware of what lies buried beneath the foundation. They laugh and talk, their faces lit by phone screens, their minds on exams and relationships and futures that feel infinite. The forest presses close against the eastern edge of campus, dark and ancient and patient, waiting for the next curious soul who ventures too deep, who stays too late, who wants to know what moves in the shadows between the trees. And somewhere in those 700,000 acres, in a place where trails don't reach and humans rarely walk, something else waits too. Something that knows how to count to 20, that marks its territory on trees and walls, that shares enough DNA with us to be called cousin, but remains different enough to be called unknown. Whether it's one creature or many, whether it's the last remnant of an evolutionary branch thought extinct, or something that was never classified to begin with, it continues to exist in the margins of human experience. The case of Sarah Lynn Garrett is solved in the only way it could be, with answers that raise more questions, with evidence that supports multiple truths, with closure that comes wrapped in continued mystery. She walked into the fog on an October evening in 1993, and 31 years later, we finally know where she ended up. But knowing where doesn't fully answer why or how or what really happened in those final moments. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be fully solved. Maybe some truths are too strange for the world we've built, too uncomfortable for the certainty we crave. Or maybe, just maybe, we share this world with more than we're willing to admit, with species we've dismissed as folklore, with intelligence we've refused to acknowledge, with wildness that persists despite our best efforts to tame and explain everything. Sarah knew that, in her way. She understood that the forest had its own sovereignty, its own rules, its own inhabitants. She respected that boundary, even as she explored it, and perhaps in the end she met something on the other side of that boundary, something that reminded us all how little we truly know about the world beyond our lights and roads and comfortable explanations. The truth is out there, somewhere between the trees and the evidence, between the known and the unknown, between what we can prove and what we can only feel. And for those willing to look, for those brave or foolish enough to venture beyond the mapped trails and into the deep woods where shadows move with purpose and footsteps echo with weight, that truth is still waiting. Just like it waited for Sarah, just like it waits for us all.